The night crept over Kyiv like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the streets one light at a time. First the subway tunnels went dark, then the bridges over the Dnipro, then the thin lines of neon that marked cafes and kiosks. What began as a flicker became a wave, a silence so deep that even the dogs stopped barking. The city that never truly slept had fallen into an unnatural slumber. Inside a small apartment near Maidan, Mara, a cybersecurity analyst, sat frozen before her laptop. The last data stream she'd been monitoring, encrypted traffic between several European intelligence servers, had just vanished mid-transfer. Lines of code blinked red, replaced by cascading symbols that made no sense. Her screens filled with fragments of corrupted instructions. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a message. Someone was inside the networks, and they weren't just stealing data. They were erasing the eyes and ears of an entire continent. Across town, emergency operators scrambled to reroute power. But even their backup systems were failing. Hospitals flickered between light and dark. Ventilators beeped erratically. Without the grid, even secure communication lines were dead. No one could tell if this was sabotage or an accident, but the timing was too perfect. In a dim basement filled with old radio equipment, Oleg, a retired signal engineer, tuned through the static. For years, he had listened for strange transmissions, the ghost chatter of a world invisible to most. Tonight, the air was thick with coded bursts, rhythmic, deliberate like digital Morse code. Between the static, he caught something that made his heart skip, a distorted voice in English saying, "Operation begins." Europe blind. Back in her apartment, Mara's phone buzzed once and went dead. She lit a candle, absurd in a digital world, and stared at the message frozen on her second screen. Multiple intrusions, intelligence grid compromised. Outside, the city glowed faintly from car headlights and battery lamps. People gathered on balconies, whispering, confused. Somewhere far off, a generator coughed to life. The sound was almost comforting. Mara pulled on her coat, grabbed her encrypted drive, and whispered to herself, "This isn't a hack, it's a declaration." Above her, the stars burned cold and merciless. For the first time in years, the sky was free of interference, pure, unfiltered, and terrifyingly silent. By morning, Europe had awakened to confusion. Satellites that normally streamed intelligence to secure command centers showed only static. Entire sectors of encrypted communication networks were silent, not jammed, not destroyed, but eerily absent, as though someone had neatly erased them from existence. Analysts across NATO's cyber defense divisions called it the Black Grid event. In Helsinki, the cold light of dawn spilled across the Ministry of Defense. Minister Elina Nurmi, her grey hair tied in a severe knot, stood over a holographic map that no longer made sense. Red markers, the symbols of Allied surveillance nodes, had vanished overnight. "We've lost 3/4 of our live reconnaissance feeds," her chief aide reported, voice trembling. "And the replacements we're getting from Brussels don't match our archives." It wasn't just missing data. The new feeds contained false intelligence, carefully crafted to mislead. The revelation hit like a punch. "This isn't theft," Nurmi murmured. "It's rewriting reality." Within hours, Finland's government convened an emergency session. The ministers argued behind closed doors as storm clouds gathered over the city. Some demanded immediate retaliation, a cyber strike in kind. Others warned that the enemy was baiting them into chaos. Nurmi, pragmatic and cautious, made her stance clear. "We do not move until we know what's real. NATO must halt operations until verification is complete." Her words spread faster than any virus. Across Europe, news outlets replayed the statement, calling it the Finnish pause. It was both a plea and a warning, a sign that even the most disciplined allies no longer trusted the shared systems that bound them together. Meanwhile, in Brussels, inside a subterranean NATO command room, exhausted technicians pored over endless data fragments. Someone had replaced crucial reconnaissance images with deepfake satellite photos. Phantom troop movements appeared on screens, non-existent convoys, fake airstrikes, false evacuations. The digital fog of war had become literal. Back in Kyiv, Mara and her former colleague from the signals unit traced the pattern by hand, redrawing lost nodes on paper maps. They didn't hit everything, he said. Just the links that make us trust each other. Mara stared at the incomplete map. Cities half erased, borders redrawn by invisible hands. That's the real attack, she whispered. Not to destroy, but to divide. Outside, the snow began to fall, covering the world in deceptive peace. A week after the blackout, the continent was alive with noise, not the hum of machines, but the roar of confusion. Every capital had its own theory, its own accusation, its own demand for action. News anchors called it Europe's invisible war. Citizens stocked up on supplies, fearing something worse than power cuts. The invisible had become terrifyingly tangible. In a NATO conference hall in Brussels, rows of tired officials sat beneath glaring fluorescent lights. Their screens flickered with half-restored data streams, while translators whispered updates into earpieces. General Roth, a veteran with scars of old conflicts, slammed his hand on the table. We can't just wait. If we don't retaliate, we show weakness. Across from him, a cyber operations officer named Jonas shook his head. General, we can't hit back when we don't even know who's holding the knife. Every trace leads to a dead end, or worse, to another ally's IP address. Someone wants us fighting shadows. The debate grew heated. Finland's representative, stern and unflinching, reiterated her country's stance. Pause all joint operations until system integrity is verified. Words echoed like a challenge. Some allies nodded in reluctant agreement. Others glared, calling it strategic paralysis. Outside the chambers, the world's media spun the story into chaos. Headlines screamed of betrayal, espionage, and collapse. Social networks overflowed with conspiracy. Theories and that NATO had been infiltrated from within, that an AI rebellion had begun, that even civilian networks were infected. The more they searched for truth, the murkier it became. Amid the noise, a small glimmer of resistance formed. In a basement lab in Warsaw, independent journalists, hackers, and data scientists began to connect the dots. They called themselves the Lantern Project, a network of volunteers determined to uncover the truth behind the blackout, using fragments of code, open-source forensics, and intercepted transmissions. They began to piece together a pattern. Mara, now working with them unofficially, discovered a repeating signal, a tiny, almost invisible data packet hidden in multiple attacks. It pulsed like a digital heartbeat, marking every compromised network. She forwarded it to her NATO contact, whispering to herself, whoever did this. They left their shadow behind. The revelation didn't solve the mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The attacker was still unseen, but the battlefield had shifted from the grid to the mind. Europe was now fighting not just for security, but for truth itself. Months passed before Europe began to breathe again. The lights were back, the data streams restored, and the headlines had grown quieter. But something invisible had changed. Trust, once the invisible currency that held alliances together, had become fragile, conditional, and endlessly audited. The Black Grid event, as history would later name it, was more than a cyberattack. It was a mirror, forcing nations to see the fractures beneath their polished unity. In Kyiv, the air was sharp with winter. Snow glittered on rooftops, and the hum of repaired substations filled the silence that once felt endless. Mara walked along the riverbank, clutching her worn notebook, pages filled with diagrams, frequencies, and coordinates that had once guided her through chaos. She had become both witness and survivor of a digital war that never officially happened. In Helsinki, Minister Elina Nurmi addressed a summit of defense leaders. What we lost was not infrastructure, she said calmly, but certainty. The world saw how easily trust can be rewritten. Our greatest weapon now is not firepower, but verification. Her statement marked the birth of a new doctrine, the Resilience Protocol, a framework requiring all European defense and intelligence networks to run on transparent, cross-audited systems. Machines would still guard borders, but humans would guard the truth. The Lantern Project, once a ragtag coalition of hackers and analysts, had evolved into an official EU cyber resilience unit. They worked without hierarchy, united by a single principle. Every lie leaves a pattern. Mara joined them permanently, leading a team devoted to digital forensics. Their first mission was simple, but symbolic: track down the remnants of the code that started it all. Somewhere in the labyrinth of erased servers and broken keys, the attackers' final trace still pulsed, faint but alive. Late one evening, Mara stood on her balcony, the city lights stretching out like veins of gold. A drone hummed overhead, harmless this time, carrying medical supplies. The stars above were clear again, indifferent as ever. She whispered, "They tried to blind us and we learned to see in the dark." The world had not ended in flames or ruin. Instead, it had entered a new era, one where silence could be as deadly as war, and light, however faint, was the most powerful weapon of all.